10 years ago, I went to Mexico to visit the Maya ruins. And as I gazed on these abandoned cities, I was struck by the parallel between the Maya collapse and our global predicament. Just as the Maya grew too numerous for the carrying capacity of their local environment, so the global population threatened to outgrow the carrying capacity of the whole planet. And if a great civilization like that of the Maya could collapse, maybe the same thing could happen to our global civilization today. And if it did, how would the survivors cope? So to answer these questions, I came up with a rather strange idea. I decided that I would try to simulate life after the collapse of global civilization. So I wrote a scenario in which I imagined how our current global technological civilization could collapse under the weight of converging tectonic stresses, such as resource depletion, climate change, a series of financial crises. Billions of people would die, but a few people might survive by retreating to the countryside, by setting up lifeboat communities in isolated rural areas where they could grow or catch their own food. And I decided that I would invite volunteers to join me in this location that I'd chosen in the Scottish Highlands. And together we would act out this scenario of global collapse. It would be a kind of collaborative role play, a kind of collaborative storytelling. And we had about well over 300 applications to join. But the land that I had managed to secure, even though it was big, it could still only support about 15 people. So we had a revolving door policy where when one person left, someone else could come and take their place. And people could stay for as little as 2 weeks. They could stay for up to 3 months. Everyone had to bring a skill. And I put at the bottom of my webpage, think of a cross between Plato's Academy and the beach. Now, if you've seen the movie The Beach or read the book, that's not exactly an optimistic suggestion. But at the time, the whole negative implications of referring to something like the beach completely escaped my mind. So when I first arrived in Scotland and the first volunteers came to join me, we started building our accommodations. We decided to build yurts to live in. This was because yurts, if you don't know, are the shelter for the traditional Mongolian nomads. And I thought, well, if they keep the nomads in Mongolia warm at temperatures of -40 or -50, surely this is going to be good in Scotland. They have a stove in the middle which keeps you warm through the night. But what I didn't realize quite at the time was that Mongolia is very cold, just like Scotland. But unlike Mongolia, Scotland is also very, very wet. And many times I would wake up in the night after going to sleep very warm and dry to find that the wind had fumbled open some gap in the canvas. There'd be rain dripping on my head. The stove would have gone out. I was shivering to death. And I would curse the day that I ever decided to build these yurts. But even so, it was fun to start with. It was great to be outdoors all day long, chopping wood in the sun. It was summer when I arrived, so it was warm. We would prepare the ground for cultivation. We would cook over an open fire and tell stories at the evening. We'd sit around making music. There were some really colorful characters that came along. There was Adam. who, when I first met him, was wearing a British Airways blanket and a cowboy hat with a feather stuck in his hatband, and who, with his grey beard and his gnarled face, reminded me of Gandalf out of Lord of the Rings, except that his kind of sweet blue eyes and his friendly voice were much more approachable than that rather intimidating wizard. And Adam was always talking about the Great Spirit, so whenever we had an argument, it was always, let's do what the Great Spirit says we should do. And it was kind of strange how the Great Spirit always ended up agreeing with Adam. So there was also Harmony. Harmony was 23. She looked even younger with her little baby face and her messy brown hair falling around her shoulders. She played the guitar, of course. And her skill that she brought to the community was to entertain us with music and to help our guided meditations. Sometimes it was better to have people who could actually grow things, but hey. So the fun, though, began to gradually subside as summer turned into August, into autumn, and then into winter. It got colder, wetter. I began to lose weight. And when you think about the end of the world all day long, every day, for months on end, it does crazy things to you. And I began to drift into the darkest, deepest depression of my whole life. Eventually, I became suicidal. And I got so bad that I had to be detained under the Mental Health Act, which in the UK gives doctors the right and the obligation to force you to go to psychiatric hospital. And I was spent a month in a psychiatric hospital trying to work out where I'd gone wrong. And you know what? The psychiatric hospital, it was the sanest place where I'd been for a year. Compared to the people in Utopia, the other patients, they were actually pretty sane. In fact, it becomes quite hard to tell the difference between someone who's sane and someone who's mentally ill after a while. In a mental hospital, a lot of them sounded and looked pretty sane to me. But then everything you do in a mental hospital is interpreted as crazy behavior. So when I was making notes, sometimes the nurses would say that I'd been indulging in writing behavior, which would... So I was very lucky. I had a great psychiatrist. My psychiatrist listened to me. He downloaded stuff that I'd written. He told me that I still had a future. But when I said, well, what do I go from here? I have nothing left. I'd spent all my money on this experiment. I'd sold my house to fund the experiment. I'd given up my job. The few remaining possessions I had were sitting in a shipping container in the bottom of this muddy field. There's nothing left. He said, you'll just have to start again. And that seemed the most intimidating, overwhelming thought at the time. But eventually, after a month, I was released from hospital, and I wasn't well again at that point, nowhere near it. It took me a year before I felt fully well, fully normal again. But I was functional, and that was already a lot better than when I went into hospital. So what did I learn from this experiment? I learned a lot of things. I can't tell you all of the things now that I learned, but one of the things I learned was to appreciate all the little things that previously I'd taken for granted. Things like toilet paper or toothpaste. It's these tiny little things, because these didn't exist, right? Once we'd run out of these, there was no more toilet paper, no more toothpaste, because civilization had been destroyed. So we had to make do with what else we had. So we had to, I'll leave it up to your imaginations. Or not just the physical things, but the higgledy-piggledy ramshackle institutions that are all around us, that we're trying to create a better world, and we often criticize the democracy that we have around us, and I do as well. I think we can do much better than the political institutions we have. But they're already a lot better than none. And I've learned to appreciate that kind of R&D work that's gone on over thousands of years. Even if they're full of errors at the moment, they're fragile, beautiful institutions. And I also discovered that I wasn't invulnerable. I wasn't indestructible. But I discovered I was stronger in some ways than I'd realized before. And I also became fearless in many ways. Almost as if I had kind of used up every last bit of fear in my body. And I'm not afraid of the collapse of civilization anymore. Not because I think it won't happen. I mean, who knows? But because I spent a year looking it in the face. And when, it's like all the horror movies, when the monster shows his face, it's suddenly not so scary anymore. It's only before you've seen the monster that you're already scared. When you've looked it straight in the face, it's somehow less frightening. When I was in hospital, my psychiatrist gave me a little book by this Polish psychiatrist called Dabrowski. And he writes about this concept called positive disintegration. Now, my disintegration didn't feel very positive at the time. But my psychiatrist said, well, what do you mean? You should understand this concept. I was like, what are you talking about? He said, your Utopia experiment. It's about finding something positive and meaningful after collapse, right? And I realized that that's what it was all about. I wasn't really thinking about the collapse of civilization. That was just a kind of smokescreen for avoiding my own personal and psychological collapse. But Dabrowski said, psychological growth is always painful. Sometimes you need to go through a real dark night of the soul to get some kind of spiritual development. Sometimes a genuine mental illness is necessary. Not always. Because what that does is it forces you to rebuild yourself in a way that is more yours. The psychological collapse strips away the basic programs, if you like, that have been instilled in you by your education when you've been growing up, by your socialization. So when that doesn't exist anymore, you have to rebuild it. And it gives you an opportunity to rebuild your set of values, your moral values, your spiritual values, in a way that's much more personal and you. So he said that a mental illness can, in a sense, be the expression of a drive for autonomy, above all, kind of moral autonomy. So it took me almost 10 years to write a book about this, because for a long time, I was really ashamed. I felt that this was the biggest mistake. It was almost as if, well, it wasn't just one mistake, it was a whole bunch of mistakes. It was like I had taken all the big mistakes I could make in my life and crammed them into one experience. Well, at least I kind of got rid of all my mistakes in one go, kind of thing. But finally, I wrote this book. It was just published in February. And writing it was a really liberating experience because it helped me to fully process, I guess, the experiences that I'd been through and that I hadn't maybe fully processed in all the years after the experiment. But it seems to be doing well now in the UK. It's still not available in the US, although I have some copies here. But we still can't sell the US rights, and that's because all the US publishers told us, we don't want to publish a book about failure. That's so New York. In San Francisco, failure is an honorable thing. It's a badge of pride. I mean, it's much easier to raise funding for a startup if you've been bankrupt at least once. And we learn far more from a failure than we do from success. Watson, the great CEO of IBM, once said, if you want to increase your success rate, double your failure rate. So I want to just leave you with one thought. Sometimes you have to follow your dreams, even if they turn into a nightmare. Because now I'm really glad that I did. I don't regret it. In fact, I'm not even sure I might not do something crazy again sometimes, if the thought takes me. Thank you very much.